It's already mayhem. Okay, Jodie, we're doing another episode of Marketing Mayhem. Thanks for coming on the podcast.
I'm always here for marketing and mayhem. So,
I think our central theme today is going to be content strategy,
yes.
which is something we should always be talking about, and everyone is curious about it. And I love our take on it because we both use different platforms and to grow our business, which I think is really important for people to hear that there's so many different ways to do that. But we both have very similar strategy,
Yeah.
if you will. So yeah.
And I think we both have a very similar, like before we hit record, even I think one of the like biggest takeaways is like because we are both so brand focused, like you should always be brand focused. My
Mhm.
favorite quote is marketing is like asking someone on a date, branding is the reason that they'll say yes.
This is the Authentic Brand Builders Podcast with Michelle Knight.
Content is the way that you get your brand out there, but you got to have that foundation. And so when I think of like content strategy, it's almost it's so like tightly, it's like, you know, that hand holding emoji. It's like
Mhm.
brand strategy, content strategy, and that's like what makes it work, I feel.
Yeah, and I think that's why I'm so obsessed with it because, we talk, obviously, you and I are very similar in like what we
I
love
love
in
so.
terms of business and what we do, but we do it for different people. We do it in
Yeah.
different ways, which is great. It's just a sure sign of like branding.
Yeah.
But the center is always the brand, right? And then everyone always
Yeah.
thinks about the marketing. But the thing that you were saying and that I always pick up on is like the thing that ties both of those together is the content,
Yeah.
right? And I tell my clients all the time, you can't avoid content creation.
No.
You
No.
can't avoid it, but it's going to make your content creation so much easier if you have the solid brand foundation. And so many people skip that because they're like, oh, I just need to create content.
Yeah.
And it becomes a whole thing.
I think when you skip the brand foundation and you skip the strategy piece, which I think it's very easy to do. So I have like a lot of compassion for this because I feel as though with like the age of information where it's like consistently like, you're consistently being told, create this content, do this, do this. Like, I feel like it's very easy to get lost in the sauce, especially if you don't have that strong foundation. But I think the biggest thing is that when you're not clear on your brand and what you're wanting to put forth and your actual underlying content strategy, you can get caught up in tactics and creating for the algorithm instead of your audience. And what happens, and we're seeing this in real time, is there's so many people, particularly with social media, who are experiencing a lot of frustration, and because their strategy that they were using or the tactics that they were using more accurately will stop working when the algorithm shifts or when
Mhm.
things change. And so I think that's where the biggest piece of content strategy comes in is when you are really solid on that, when you're solid on your brand and you're solid on your content strategy, you're going to be able to ride the waves a little bit more and you're going to be able to adapt to new platforms relatively easily because you're creating for your audience and you're creating based on the strategy and you're just optimizing for the platform and what's working right now.
Yeah, I totally agree. And that is one of the reasons that I think it's so important for entrepreneurs to understand strategy and to understand the basis, right? And I've always said that, like, no matter what platform I go to, I know how to create content
Mm-hmm.
because I know how to create content. I
Yeah.
don't know how to just do well on Instagram or just do well on YouTube.
Yeah.
I know how to create content
Yeah.
and therefore I know how to market because I have the strategy. But
Yeah.
people skip that, And so like I love to market, as all the listeners know, I love to market via, blog posts and
Yeah.
podcasts, which is our shared love, and YouTube.
Yeah.
And you are primarily social media and podcasting,
Yes.
So I think
Although
understanding that, yeah. Ooh,
I have
what are you gonna say?
publicly declared that I will be getting onto YouTube at some point this year in a bigger way because I do think that that's kind of like the natural next progression. So, when you are like in an ideal world, I feel as though you've got a presence that's like a presence that's discoverable. And I feel like for you, that's definitely, YouTube and SEO.
Mhm.
And then you've got like a really solid nurture piece to the funnel, which I love podcasting for that, because when else like before I go and hire a coach, I always go and listen to their podcast or
Mhm.
podcast interviews they've been on, because you get that depth of knowledge and you get that nuance that I think is so difficult to get anywhere else unless you're at like an in-person event.
Mhm.
And so I love it for that too. And I feel like we all need to have an email list because that's literally the only thing that we own, right? So
Right.
I think in an ideal world, like you said, there is all of these. When you have a strategy, then you can really understand like where all these different platforms are coming in. And I do think that for social media, the underrated thing, I always have to come and like give a bit of in the defense of social,
Yep.
because I feel like we
Especially here.
yeah, especially here, right? It's not just about discoverability. I think that there is a very underrated nurture piece to social media as well that has nothing to do with your reach. But if you think through the customer journey, at some point when you're going through someone's client journey, do you go search them on social? Because I know that I
Right.
always do. Always,
Really?
right?
Yeah,
Like,
if I'm further through the process, right? And so for
yeah,
anyone listening, like we all have our different variations of the customer buying journey, but here we have like the symptom stage, like you've got a symptom, then your
yeah,
problem, then you know the solution, and then you start looking around for people.
yeah,
And that is the area, right? That I think you're talking about where it's
yeah,
like that's when I'm going to listen to your podcast, that's when I'm going to go into your social media.
yes,
And what you referred to, I call it the content stack. And
yeah,
so it is very much like realizing like where do those platforms fit into your big funnel? You know,
absolutely.
so there are people that use podcasting to get in front of new people and they're going super heavy and it works to get in front
Yeah,
of new people.
for sure.
But their strategy is going to be get a lot of interviews, right? Have them share it, do a
Yeah,
lot of promo. Whereas, like, I am using with the brand awareness phase, like you mentioned, SEO or YouTube. So, what
yeah,
people are searching for, then social media for me is in my mid tier, in the
right,
middle of my stack. Just
right,
like you said, one, because I don't love it. And two, because I needed to take the pressure off of being like, oh, I hope someone finds me to be like,
right.
they already know I exist. Now they're just trying to figure out who I am and if I'm
Yeah.
right for their brand, which I love.
So true. And I love what you said too about the podcast thing, because really do see like a lot of people say, oh, podcasts aren't discoverable. And I think in the broader sense, like if you're a little bit less, if you're in a little bit less of a specific niche, I think that can be the case. Obviously, there are things that you can do to mitigate it. However, I will say for someone who is hyper niche, there will be people who will search platforms. My
Mhm.
Hairstylist Rising podcast, which was my first ever podcast, I started almost 5 years ago. Like it'll be 5 years in September, I guess. So like 4.5 years ago. That grew so quickly. And I had so many people reach out and say, hey, I found you from searching Hairstylist podcast on Spotify or on Apple.
Mhm.
So there is that discoverability piece, which I think is like really, really big, particularly if you're in a niche that's a little bit like less, there's less of those podcasts. Cause when I started I mean, there was still a lot, but like not a lot of really consistent ones that were like putting out content every week that had, and again, like leveraging those collaborations and those guests sharing it. So yeah, I do think you're right. It's really dependent on your stack. And like for me, when I look at social media, I think where there's a really big issue, and this is like kind of a rant that I go on, is people think they almost box it in too much. They box it
Mm.
into the discoverability and visibility phase. And I think that you often will sell yourself short if that's the only kind of content that you're creating, because visibility is only one piece of it for me.
And it's often very surface level, right? Especially for social media, like the visibility stuff that's going to give you the most reach. It's going to be just like tip of the iceberg, but we know the conversions and stuff are all the things that are happening with the storytelling and
Yeah,
like the carousel posts. We've talked about this on another episode where we were talking about like how valuable those are and like that's where
yeah,
clients are made.
yeah.
And I feel like this, you have to have this again, no matter what platform you're on. Like we're talking
Mhm.
about social media, but the same is true for YouTube. You know, like I'll
True.
create YouTube videos videos that are very much intended to get in front of new people.
Yeah.
And then I will create videos that are a little deeper or behind the scenes that maybe aren't going to, take off in search, but my existing audience is going to help move them through the funnel.
Yes.
So I would say the two things that so far for me in terms of a winning content strategy are, one, you have to have a content strategy, right? It's not just about the platform. And we're going to talk about some of the ways that we do that, but then also understanding that there is depth to each platform.
Yes.
And you need to figure out like what's your top priority with that platform, but then also as you can expand, be really strategic with like adding the customer buying journey on that specific platform itself.
Agreed. I think it's like you said, and this sounds really complicated, right? Like it sounds like, oh, holy crap, this is a lot to figure out. And I think that's where the benefit of like, a lot of us marketers who are teaching content, who are personal branding focused specifically, have done the legwork so that you're not having to think about this every time, right? Like you're following a content strategy, you're creating your content strategy, and then like a lot of that customer journey is pre-thought out for you. So it's not something where you're creating a piece of content every time you're thinking like, oh, where does this fit into my, because I think that's what overwhelms people a little bit. It's like when you have the strategy, that's the strategy's job, right? And then when you're creating the content, it's like done for you in a sense.
Yeah. Yes. And I always like to tell my clients in the academy, like your strategy is your system. That's what I like to say. Like you could always fall back on the system. So if it's a week where you don't feel super creative, if you have a strong strategy in place and you're doing the steps in your strategy on repeat, you can fall back on that, and that's really important to me with like the lifestyle that I live and homeschool mom and you with like the time freedom and the travel, and all of the things that we do.
100%.
And James Clear, by one of my favorite quotes, since you threw out your fave, one of my favorite quotes is, you do not rise to the level of your goal, you fall to the level of your systems. If you don't have a content system in place, then your wishes of doing this on Instagram and creating a YouTube channel and podcasting and all of that, it's not going to matter, right?
Yeah.
Because you're not going to be able to stay consistent with it. So let's talk strategy a little bit because again, we both have a very different approach and also in what we offer. You have like done for you and done with you types of packages. And I'm very much like, I'll teach you.
Yes.
So you can go do it yourself.
Yeah. 100%.
Which is great. And they work for different types of people at different stages of their business. So
and like to nerd out on human design for a second, like I do think that it is honestly like that. It's so funny because the people where I'm like, because my business partner for my retreat company is a human design reader. So she's like always talking about like human design and these offers and like all of these things. And so I think it's really funny when I like look at our human design, how much our business types are reflective of that. It's really funny.
Yeah, I know. It's crazy. And it's something I'm just like recently diving into. I think I talked about it on a recent podcast on consistency, actually, where I was talking about like understanding your human design or astrology aspects or anything like that can be really helpful in figuring out your strengths and also your weaknesses because we have them.
Absolutely. I can't think of anything more fun than like zooming out on someone's business and content strategy and like connecting the dots and like fixing all of the things. And yeah, it's just the most fun.
And people listening are probably like, you two are crazy. But
Absolutely. And yeah, that's 100%. It's like, I think that's the funny thing too, is like a lot of people are like, oh, how do you create this so easily? Because like things like hooks and all of that comes very naturally. And it honestly is just like long-term obsession and mastery over the course of many, many years. So I feel like when people are beating themselves up too, and I know we're going to get more in on strategy, but just like a little bit of a mindset shift is everyone expects themselves to be really naturally gifted content creators. And it's a skill like anything else. And if you start with the strategy, you will build that foundational knowledge so much more strongly. And it will start to feel more natural over time.
Yes. Agreed.
So what was the question? What was the...
That's a great question. I think I was asking kind of about like your content strategy, or how you, support your clients in building a content strategy. I guess that would be the question.
So, with the fact that we are social media focused, like a lot of these things, and again, like with the social focus, like we build out a content strategy that can be applied anywhere.
Mhm.
But one of the biggest things when it comes to creating that disruptive presence, it's not about being edgy. It's not about like, saying things in an aggressive way. I think that's what a lot of people think when they hear the term disruptive.
Right.
But what I think about it is where we always start with our clients and where I always start with anyone I work with one-on-one is where where do you see the difference in your industry that you want to make? Because
Mm.
with my clients, the one thing they have in common is that a lot of the time they're starting their business because they see something that they believe should be different. Like they are not content with the status quo. They want to make a difference for their people. So I work with a lot of like beauty industry and creative educators, for example, and they're teaching, other people in their communities like how to do things and or how to build a business, or even if it's like a technique, if you're teaching photography or whatever it is.
Mhm.
And so that's where we really start, like what is the ripple effect that you want to create? What do you want to be known for, and what do you want to see done differently? And
Mm.
so I think when you start there, I call what I really like to start leading with is areas of impact. So, what are the areas that you want to impact in your industry? So, for me, it's the importance of like personal branding and that being such an asset for you. Like your brand is an asset regardless of whether you are working with brands or you are teaching like independent classes. That is the one thing where it's like building your brand on what you want to be known for and what you do for your people. And
Mhm.
so that would be one of mine. The other one would be conquering the fear of being seen, because that's a huge piece. A lot of my clients like really struggle to step up and actually own that leadership. They don't want to be disliked, they don't want to be judged. And I think that's a very, that's something that we've all dealt with at some point. And then the third area of impact for me is like, how do we translate that into content? How do we actually market that? How do we get that out into the world? The visibility piece, right? So when I create a strategy, I always like to think of, sometimes people have two areas of impact, or they'll have one, or they'll have three. Most of the time, I feel like that kind of rounds it out nicely.
Mhm.
And that's what you're going to start creating content on. That is where you are going to make sure that you are repeating yourself over and over and over again and sharing your unique viewpoint. You're going to share, sometimes we're sharing the hows, we're sharing the whys, we're sharing the whats. Like we're really building mastery and reputation,
Mhm.
creating content in those areas. And then I have another couple pieces to the strategy with it being
Yeah.
for social. One of the other pieces of the strategy is visibility content. So that is where we are going to look at what is working well for your account, what is working well for your audience, and how can we leverage that to get in front of more people and to optimize the content as much as
Mm.
possible.
Mhm.
And then there's the storytelling piece of both you and your clients. And then social proof, like media, PR, client wins, all of that type of thing. And so
Mhm.
that's really where, and like your story pulls in like your unique values and your viewpoints and all of those things. And I really believe in creating your brand as, like I always say that you are your brand, I think is like just a piece of advice that is so oversimplified. And really we need to focus on building a brand that makes it very clear what you do for your clients and why they should care. Like
And
why.
what you stand for,
Yes,
I will
yes, yes.
add in there.
Absolutely. Like that's, and I feel like we miss out when it comes to the content strategy. One of the pieces that I think people miss out on the most is making it very clear what do you do for your clients and why does it matter to them?
Mhm. Mhm.
So when you kind of like roll out all of those pieces and you're making sure to consistently incorporate those, repetition equals reputation. And when it comes to a content strategy, like that's how we've kind of made it work really well for social. But you
Yeah.
can apply a lot of that to every single content channel that you have.
Yeah, I mean, I see so much crossover and,
Yeah.
like, the approach that I take from more of, like, an evergreen kind
Yes.
of one main thing every single week, but I love what you're sharing about repetition, because I think one of the things that a lot of people get nervous about on social media, because there's so much more volume, right? Like
Yes.
you're not posting a YouTube video every single day. If you're doing that, you are absolutely insane.
Yeah.
That's like so much work. You're not doing a podcast every single day.
Yeah.
This long form content, you're not doing, but social demands it.
Yeah.
And it demands that frequency. And like, if you're not repeating yourself, you're doing yourself a disservice, because one,
Huge.
repetition is going to build authority. It's
Yeah.
going to build reputation, but
Yeah.
it's also going to make sure that like people are seeing the content, because
Yes.
if you don't repeat it, chances are they missed that. They absolutely missed that.
Not only will they miss it, but even if they are seeing it every single time, people need that. Like that is where you're going to get buy-in for your ideas. And that's where I think the visibility exclusive strategy when it comes to social media really cuts people off at the knees, because they'll post something, they'll be like, oh, that didn't do that well, and then they'll never post it again. And it's like, no, we need to optimize this. Like when you're creating a new strategy, I don't even want you to look at your insights for like 30 to 60 days. And honestly, I prefer it closer to 90, because
90.
then at that 90-day mark, that's when we can look back. And the only reason I say 30 or 60 is like in my agency, we will look at those points so we can see if there's any trends off the bat where we're like, oh, okay, we can optimize this a little bit in this fashion, or, this style of reel is working really well, or this style of carousel. So like there are things that we can look at a little bit to be a bit responsive, but honestly, if you're implementing it yourself, I would not even think about it for 3 months of consistently putting out that really specific content. Because the thing is that the sales content, the things that are going to move people, is not going to get the same metrics a lot of the time as the visibility content. And if you're measuring your sales content by reach and engagement, like it's the wrong metric. Like you just can't measure it in that way. Like I had a couple posts that I put out like, a couple weeks ago, and one of them got so much reach, so much engagement, tons of shares, like hundreds and hundreds of shares. And, it grew my audience a little bit of relevant people because of, the people that were coming to my profile and seeing what I was about and, feeling aligned with it. And then I put out a post, a couple days later that got, I don't know, a 10th or a 20th of the reach and engagement. And I got 3 DMs about my program,
Right.
So it's like a tapestry. And I feel like I always think about it as like a patchwork quilt on social media. So you're not just going to put one color on once. That's crazy.
Right.
Taylor Swift became a billionaire re-recording her old songs, going on tour singing the same songs over and over and over again. And you're afraid to post about something twice? Like what?
Yes. Yeah. And because again, I take a very multi-channel approach. Not only are people afraid to post on the same platform, but they're also afraid to like overwhelm their audience. If like, well, I released a YouTube video on this and a podcast, like, should I also post on Instagram and put up? Absolutely. Because it goes back to the idea that you've got to have these multiple touch points. Like we are multi-channel, my friends. Like we are in a multi-channal age because attention span is so low and there are so many people talking at once.
You need to safeguard your business too, because how many times does someone lose that get locked out of their YouTube account or get locked out of their Instagram account?
It doesn't matter, right? We always say Instagram is like but it happens to any account online.
Absolutely.
I had even Pinterest like years ago. My Pinterest just plummeted and they told me that like I wasn't meeting standards. I went from like 1.5 million views to like 5,000 views a month, and it was insane. But I also knew that I had YouTube and I had podcasting and I had this. And so like there's a little bit of a bubble panic, but like I'm not like, oh my God, my whole business is going to implode on itself, because again, I know how to create content and I know how to create content well. And so I love what you shared about the different aspects to consider with content, because one of the pieces of the strategy that I think a lot of people forget, and I am guilty of this at times because I'm very much a systems person. So I'm like, okay, first we do this, 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 and this. But diversifying the content ideas and how you come up with content is is a rinse and repeat system, but you got
Yeah.
to make sure you're hitting all of those marks to attract new people,
Yeah.
to build connection, to increase conversions,
Yeah.
and then just cycling through that. And I feel like on social media, you brought up a good point. Like it's really easy to like fall into a certain type of content.
Yes.
I think on long form content, it's really easy for people to forget that not everything has to be searchable. And so
Yes.
this is something that comes up a lot with my clients where they're like, "Oh, I really want to create a blog post on this topic, or I really want to create a YouTube video on this topic, but like it's not coming back with really strong SEO." And I'm always like, "I don't care then." You
Yeah.
know, like not every just like on Instagram, not every post is going to be a hit.
Mhm.
And not every post is necessarily going to work right away. And that's one of the reasons I love Evergreen is because I've posted so many things that I was like, God, that thumbnail sucked. That video sucked. And now 2 years later, it's like got 12,000 views.
Yeah.
And
That's
it just needed some time. It needed a trend. It needed, whatever. So
awesome.
I think when it comes to the content strategy, I love what you shared about the disrupt in the beginning because I think that's such a strong place.
Yeah.
I work with so many entrepreneurs that coming up and generating content is so overwhelming for them. And so my kind of secret sauce to add to yours is we just start with storytelling out of the gate. Like we
Mm,
can
love
always
that.
talk about ourselves. You can,
Yeah.
and like you do it anyway. We
Yeah.
could do it online. But coming from the angle of like your story connecting to your ideal customer. And
Yes.
obviously those pieces you talked about, like those are all inside my branding foundation. So the
Right.
idea is that like you go through that and then creating content's a lot easier.
Yeah.
And so, the stories that you can share, your journey, your mission, your values, what are the things how did you overcome an obstacle? What's a transformation that you went through? I mean, this is what I did for the first 6 months. I didn't
Yeah.
have client testimonials. I didn't have a whole page of videos and stuff that spoke for my program. I just had to use my personal experience
Yeah.
as an example.
Yeah.
And that was before personal branding, TikTok, that kind of stuff, influencer stuff was like booming.
Yeah.
Now it's just everyone should be doing it.
Honestly, Michelle, even when I started like 5 years ago, I was like in my industry, like I was one of the first people to lead with branding and
Mhm.
people didn't really get it at the time. Like
Yep.
it was something where I had to like do a lot of work on educating what a brand was. And so, I think it is one of those things where it's so important and it hasn't been the focus for that long. Like it really
No, it's
hasn't, but
it's true. When
yeah.
I started, there was like emotional branding was something that people were talking about on like a big like corporate angle. Like they would Nike, they advertising, but nobody was talking about it on like a personal branding
Yeah.
level or like I run my own solopreneur business or whatever. And it still cracks me up because I was like, this seems really important. And I made a blog post about it. And still to this day, this blog post gets like 50,000 views every year because it
Wow.
just does so well,
Right.
because it's
Right.
a concept that has just continued to expand.
Yeah.
And so, adding that in what we're talking about into the content strategy,
Yeah.
the very first part of a content strategy, as you already shared, isn't so much like where am I showing up?
Yeah.
How often am I showing up? How am I repurposing my content? It's what do
Yeah.
I want to stand for? What's my story? How do I want my audience to feel?
Yes.
And just starting there and then adding tools like SEO tools to come up with content ideas,
Yeah.
chatting with ChatGPT,
Yeah.
looking at market research so that you literally never run out of a content idea.
Yeah, exactly. And I think it's like the platforms are secondary. Like I always say like social media is a tool, not your boss. And like I
Mhm.
think that's the same for every single platform. Like it's not it's a tool for you to get your message out there. And I think that there's so much, people throw around the word strategy when what they're referring to is tactics. And so when we talk about a strategy, like it is not something that is going to necessarily, yes, of course, everything will evolve as you evolve, but this isn't something that you need to necessarily be like going revising every month, right? It's
Yes.
the strategy is foundational. The tactics will evolve, but like posting on like some people will be like, what's your content strategy? Like how often do you post? That's
Mhm.
not a strategy. That is tactics. That is
Yes.
like that's like,
Yeah.
the icing, And so I love what you're saying. I think it's so true.
I love what you're saying. It's so powerful. I love the way that you said that because it was like a different angle that I haven't said before. And I think that that's really important
Yeah.
because a lot of people, and you hear this a lot, you're throwing spaghetti at the wall. Most entrepreneurs are. And I
Yeah.
did an episode recently on consistency.
Mhm.
And I talked a lot about the system and a lot about the strategy. But most times the consistency is just because you don't have something to fall back on. You
Yes.
don't have a solid strategy. You
Yeah.
are just like, I got to post. I got to
Yeah.
post. But like, why are you posting? What is
Yes.
the goal of this post? Did you do that goal recently? Are you cycling through making sure that you're hitting brand awareness, brand attraction, and brand
Yeah.
connection? These are all the questions that you kind of have to build with the strategy. I'd love to also just talk a little bit of like the system, if you will, because one of
Mhm.
the things I've been really curious to ask you about, because I have a lot of my clients who are like, okay, Michelle, planning a quarter of content at a time sounds great. So the approach that I take is basically 12 topics
Mhm.
because we're focused on long form content and then
Right.
repurposing that. But what if someone, I just got this idea when you were chatting, what if someone was like primarily focused on social media right now,
Mhm.
but loved the idea of like a weekly theme? Do you think that that would work? And like, how could you use like what you shared about like the disrupt and the storytelling and that into that mix?
So, yes, I think it would work to an extent,
Hmm.
and I think you could definitely do that. I tend to go more on your bigger picture and then like switch up the delivery of it. So like if you had those 12 topics, like
Hmm.
for example, I would kind of like pull out, okay, what are we gonna like, how does this relate to like your foundational like messaging essentially? Because it always does, right? And then
Right.
like
It
essentially
should.
yeah, exactly. Like what I always do in terms of strategy is a mixture of experimental content, proven content,
Mhm.
and then, some like storytelling content as well. And so everything does have an element of story in it, but
Mhm.
essentially like I would take out, okay, is this an angle that we haven't necessarily tried before on a topic that we know you want to build reputation in? So that's kind of how I think you could do it. Are you talking about like repurposing from the long form? Or are you talking if you are social media forward?
Yeah, I'm just thinking like social media forward
Yeah.
because I so like yeah, so like for example, let's say this week was all about like brand story. Like
Mhm.
that's the main thing that I wanted to drive home. And so
Yeah.
like could you take what is brand storytelling?
Yeah.
Why is brand storytelling impactful? How
Yeah.
brand storytelling changed my business
Yeah.
and like using that theme but taking the different angles that you talked about.
You could definitely do a content series on that.
Mm,
Absolutely. I do think though, when it comes to social media, like we said before, like it is a lot more volume. It is a lot more of that strategy. So I don't tend to like do things and it's like, okay, we're only going to talk about this week.
right.
I would say you're a lot better off to like create a ton of content on that topic. If you're creating a long form piece of content about it, you can likely get like six
Yeah,
like, even
easily.
just without thinking about it, like 6
Easily.
content out of that, and I would weave that into your overall strategy so that you're creating that repetition. Because I think
Mhm.
that's the difference with social media is that when someone comes to your page, for example, like, I want it to be front and center what I wanna be known for, what I help people with. I want that at the top, and so if you can kinda, like, mix it in, that would be probably the strategy I would take. So you can
Mm,
create that content based on your weekly theme, but I would probably juggle that up a little bit more
okay, yeah.
and create it based on your and essentially too, like I am a batching advocate through and through.
Yeah.
And so if you can create that, then think about how much further ahead you're getting. Like you can really kill it with that.
Yeah, and I really love that take because I think one of the main things that my audience comes to me for is just like, is the coming up and planning content. It just
Yeah.
is very overwhelming for a lot of people.
Yeah.
Especially when you already are strapped for time and you're like, now
Yeah.
I gotta sit down and like plan
Yeah.
a whole quarter. So I love this take where I'm getting that you could essentially pick your 12 themes.
Yeah.
Then you could say under each of those themes, these are the types of content, but you're saying kind of cycle through them. So it's not just
Yes.
1 week, 1 week, 1 week. So the same
Absolutely.
exact strategy applies
Yeah.
as you would use for long form content. Because
Exactly.
again, this is exactly what we do. We say, like, hey, what's going to be the topic each week? You would
Yeah.
create a long form piece of content. And by long form, I mean video, typically YouTube, podcast, or blog,
Mhm.
then you would be able to dissect that and repurpose that in a bunch of different places.
Yes, and with social, one of the benefits of social media versus other platforms is the responsiveness, right? So like it is like and long term, like with a lot of these evergreen ones, like you'll see patterns and stuff. However, you can see it like faster
Yeah,
sometimes with
it
social.
gives you a nice jolt of confidence because
Yeah,
that's the hardest thing about SEO is you
yes,
have to be patient.
totally,
You
totally.
have to be patient.
And you can also see, like, I have a client who created an entire new program based on, we were creating, she was an agency client and we were creating content about her specific business model, right? Like, she has like a very unique kind of way of running her business. And anytime we create content about that, there would be so many comments and questions and all of that. And so that's another thing that you've got to, that's like an underrated like win, is like none of the posts went viral, by the way. None of them
Mhm.
went viral, even for her account, but there was just like a lot of interest, like consistently when we would post on this topic. And so she ended up creating an offer and had like a 5-figure waitlist launch the first
Wow.
time. And she had 5,000 followers on Instagram. So like, it's not like she didn't have a huge mailing list, didn't have a huge thing. It was like just responding. So that's where with social media, one of the things that I do when I'm creating content for our clients, for, even when I just did a storyboard session, which is like, we just plan, you execute type thing. And
Mhm.
the first thing we pulled up was like the analytics. And that's where I'll look and be like, okay, let's pull this theme in here. Let's pull this kind of hook in here. Let's pull this in here. And let's see if we can amplify what you're already doing that's
Mhm.
working. And then we'll add, and then we kind of pull that into the strategy based on the areas of impact and the storytelling and all of those types of things. So
Yeah.
I have
Mhm.
7 categories in the content framework that we use. And to make that like just a little bit less scary, we do 14 posts a month as the base package for our agency, because that is enough content. 3 posts a
Mm.
week is enough to get hundreds of free opt-ins.
Love that.
It's enough to build reputation. And so if you think about it, if you got 7 categories and you just kind of fill in with the ideas from your long form content, I mean, that's a no-brainer. Like you need
Mhm.
two in each
Mm.
category per month.
Mhm. Yeah.
Not a
Yeah,
lot.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, so, the I love it because it's even got my brain thinking as someone who just created a second Instagram and haven't announced it yet because 'cause I'm over here, "Why the frick not?" But the big thing that I'm, like, really picking up from our conversation is obviously the base of every winning content strategy is your brand.
Of course.
Because
100%.
if you and this is a sure sign for me. If you come to me and people do and they say, "I struggle with coming up with content ideas. I can't think of what to say." I immediately know that we have a branding problem. We don't have a platform problem. We have a branding problem because you don't know what your brand stands for. You
Yep.
don't know what you want to, like you said, disrupt in the industry, how you're help supporting your client. If you know that, the rest actually is easy.
Yep.
Then we get to just figure out a system for coming up with that content and organizing that content.
So true.
Choose your platform, choose your frequency. And
Yeah,
then you mentioned this earlier, figure out how to optimize for that specific platform,
exactly.
right? But again, a solid content strategy is coming up with the ideas, writing the content, having the hook, that can work for a video, for a podcast, for
Yeah,
social media, for email. And then once you kind of pick we call it the core platform, right? So if it's
yeah,
Instagram or YouTube, that's when you really want to hone in and say, okay, how do I succeed on this platform? What are the
exactly.
small little nuances that I have to have? Do I need a
Yeah.
thumbnail? Do my cover images matter? Does my text on screen? All of that plays a role, but that again is not necessarily that's that platform strategy. That's not your content strategy. That gets us into marketing
Exactly.
a little bit.
Yeah, and like I feel like if you were to like, when it comes to repurposing, like that is where the optimization piece comes in. So like if you were to have like just for example, like a YouTube video where you are covering like 5 different things, like you wouldn't want to put 5 different things necessarily over on Instagram unless you were promoting that episode. Like you could do a carousel pointing people, which this is another thing with like building your ecosystem, like point people in all the directions. Like
Mhm.
omnipresence is the goal.
Yep.
That's what's going to really help you like build that rapport in that relationship and give you that repetition. But like that could be a content series on Instagram, for example. So that could be a, like one thing, two thing, three thing, four thing, five thing. That could be a real series that you're like, if you want the full thing, go check out my YouTube video or come
Mhm.
back for part two, or, whatever that looks like for you. But I do think like there's so much overlap, but there are all these nuances, but the nuances are they're less scary. Like I don't freak out when new content types come out on Instagram. When I started teaching Instagram, Reels didn't even exist. So like
Yeah.
there was
Yeah. When I
there was
first
a
got on
whole lot of
Instagram,
freaking
Reels
out.
didn't exist.
Yeah. Everyone was not excited when Reels came
I
out in my world. And so yeah.
I remember when IGTV came out, you
Yes.
guys. Like
Oh
this is
my God.
I started my business the same time Facebook Live became a thing.
Yes.
And so that's kind of the again going back to what we talked about in the beginning, like my goal has always been to teach people how to create content. And that comes down to understanding their brand. Because once you know how to create content, you
Yeah.
can be successful anywhere because
Agreed.
they all work. You have to find the one that works best for you. Like if you don't like being on video, then don't make YouTube videos.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right?
For
You're
sure.
gonna really struggle there. Do podcasting, whatever it is. But the
Yeah.
fundamentals of a strong content strategy really come down to these pieces that we talked about. Yeah.
Yes. And also like it is a visibility piece, yes, but also like I really always want to emphasize the importance of building reputation in a specific area, and content is the only way to do that.
Mhm.
That's how you're going to get like, for example, if I want to record a podcast episode about brand storytelling, I'm going to call Michelle. If someone comes up to me and is like, I'm really having trouble figuring out my brand's like story, I'm going to point them to Michelle. Like, so when you create consistent like content on something,
Mhm.
that is how you're going to build reputation. And it's going to, if someone was looking for a speaker at an event about brand storytelling, there would probably be 10 people who would put forward your name because you built reputation in that area, right? So
Right.
I think that's another kind of underrated piece to content, is that is how you are going to like consistently creating that depth of content and that breadth of knowledge and sharing that. That's the only way to build that reputation, and you're going to get those referrals and all of those things from that.
Yeah, I almost like want to add like the repetition into like a repurposing structure. You know what I mean? Because
Yes.
they're the same, but they're not the same. Because like
Yeah.
repurposing very much just, just like extending the life of your content. That's what I like
Yeah.
to call it, extending the life of your content. But repetition is repeating those key pillars
Yeah.
of your brand. And like I teach my clients how to do a content map by
Yeah.
simply just taking their core offer and figuring out what are the main pillars of that offer and then generating content ideas around those pillars, right? Because then everything points back to the offer.
Yes. Oh my
Every,
God.
which makes like then marketing becomes selling without
Yeah.
actually having to sell, which is great.
Oh my goodness. Yes. This is so true, because I actually was just having this conversation on a different podcast yesterday about how a lot of the time people think about their brand strategy and their offers as like separate.
No.
They really need to live together and be
Mhm.
harmonious, because why are you bothering to build brand reputation, something that you don't have an offer in? Like,
Yeah. Well, and the other thing I always say is like when you finish your brand, you should be immediately into content mode. Like
yes.
as soon as your brand foundation is set, you should immediately be creating content because you should have everything that you need.
Yeah.
So why would you start creating content if you weren't clear on where you were leading people?
So
That's
true.
why phase 4 of our branding process is what's your offer.
Yeah.
And they can come back and create more, but
Yeah.
what's the main one that you're starting with?
Because that's really how you're going to help people. You
Yeah,
can
and then if
create
you
all the content in the world, and at the end of the day, like if they don't have an opportunity to go deeper with you, like that's where it's going to end, like you're priming people for,
and what happens if you go viral? Or what happens if something takes off and then you have no way to monetize on the back end? Like you're said that what? No, don't do
exactly.
that.
Exactly.
Okay. This was great. I love it.
Okay.
Oh, I love talking about
I
all
can't
the
wait for
things.
the next one. We'll have to pick another
I
topic.
know. We'll pick another
I feel
topic.
like if anyone has an idea for a topic they want us to go mayhem on, they should
Oh.
definitely pop that in.
Yeah, pop it below the YouTube video, or you can send us a message on Instagram. Michelle Knight Co is my handle. Jodie.
It's Jodie Brown.
I knew that.
Yeah.
Talk like every day on Instagram. Like, what's your handle?
Once you're in the
And
DMs, you can't see the handle anymore.
it's true. It's true. I just see your face. So yeah, let us know if you have another like marketing. You just want to get our like random thoughts. We don't prepare for these interviews or have questions. It's not even an interview. It's just us talking. They're
It's a
beneficial.
conversation. I feel like there's always so many nuggets in there, though.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, thank you again for another episode here of Marketing Mayhem. And thanks for everyone for tuning in.
Thanks for having me.